Hello everyone. Um, Today I'm going to go over a topic that I think a lot of people think they understand, and they often get wrong, and that is that of power, but not just power, but how to understand and then operate in the world around it. Um, a lot of people like to defer to history, to cycle theory, to science. This is not really any of those things. Uh, it's just law, really. Um, Law and then human psychology as it is today. And I am one of the few who I think is going to say that human psychology has evolved quite a bit, especially with the advent of social media, but probably, I would say, media in general since the 60s. Maybe Bernays would probably be the precursor to all of this. Um, Power today is that of manipulation and engineered consent. It has nothing to do with what I see a lot of people talk about online today about left versus right, rich versus poor. It's kind of that, but it's a lot more complicated in my opinion. Um, this this mini lecture, has been taken largely from a man by the name of Nima Parvini, who is a proponent of elite theory, which I also am a proponent of. And so today I will do my best to relate to you, I would say, like 30 years worth of information in a couple of slides, so let's see how well I can do that. First is the rule. Um, it's a really simple rule. An organized minority shall always rule a disorganized mass. Now, we live in a democracy, right? And in a democracy, allegedly, we have control over, what we vote for and things of that nature. And it may have been that way at one point, but what we have today is closer to a plutocracy. Now, you can definitely go to your polls and you can vote and you can think you have a say, but you don't actually pick these people that you choose to rule over you. People with money do. It's the organizations, it's the systems, it's what we would call the deep state sometimes, if you want to call them that. And this rule is consistent across all of natural law. Um, it's across all of human civilization. Humans are very disorganized, and a small group of high IQ individuals, doesn't really matter, usually it's whoever has the highest in combination with the most autonomy and willingness to do what they need to do to rule, will always attain kingship, if you will, over the disorganized mass. They follow a method. The method is, again, really simple. BS, 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 BS. Therefore, you shall comply. Now, this is across all hierarchies, not just power that you would think in like a political sense. It's just power, period. If you have, let's say, a church. Church has a specific set of beliefs. Maybe it's specific to that sect of Protestantism, for example. They'll go in the book in the Bible and they'll say, oh, look at this verse. That's the BS. And then it's therefore comply with what I want you to do. You can go into politics and you can be like, oh, we need more immigrants, right? Because who's gonna make our tacos, and who's gonna work these jobs that no one wants to do? We need to let more in. It's BS, BS. Therefore, do what I want you to do. You can do this with anything. It doesn't matter. The people in charge want something, and they will tell you whatever combination of words to get you to shut up and go away. It's not that it doesn't matter what the BS is. The BS is just a means to an end. They're just talking. Whatever they want will happen. Does not mean you don't have autonomy. It's just understand this is how this works. Now, who's doing all of this, right? Well, there's a lot of people, because there's a lot of wealth in this world now. But the three main factions are going to be the neocons, the techno-globalists, and the third worldists. These are going to be the largest. The neocons and the techno-globalists are obviously the largest, and then the third worldists are in close second. For those of you who need a real-world comparison, the neocons are the ones who have sided with the Democrats, and the techno-globalists have sided with the Republicans, or I guess the Magastanis, as I call them. The neocons would be the Wokistanis. And then the third worldists would be the Marxists, people who are in excess for factions, but they're not as powerful or well organized. I have a little breakdown here if you want to pause and read it, but I'll just do a brief summary of each. The neocons wants to remake the world in America's image. They've been in power for a very long time. As you know, they've created NATO, which is forcing Europe to be as America. That's why they're forcing all sorts of minorities and large swaths of violent barbarians through their gates, is because America does that, therefore Europe must do that, and if they don't, they're bad, and they'll demoralize and do things like that. Obviously, the goal is to maintain the American empire, and Europe is our vassal state, and they intend to keep it that way. They are pro-Israel, right? Anti-Semitism is not allowed with them, because that's, I think, one of, if not the biggest funder. And a lot of them have dual relations with Israel as well, since going back to the 60s, so, I mean, that's to be expected. It's not that one has more power over the other, it's a duopoly, so they use hard and soft power, so sometimes they'll use the CIA, make a coup, and sometimes they'll use the military, just storm into the deserts like we did with Afghanistan. Forever wars are their bread and butter, it's how they make all of their money. And then, of course, they use lobbyists, media, things like that, to ensure that they stay in power. This is a well-known group. They've been here for a long time. The techno-globalists have only been around since, I think, in power, I would say probably 2010. But they've been around since the 70s, just like the neocons have. I mean, the WEF started in the 70s, so. But yeah, they're globalists. They want a one world global institute. They want the removal of, distinctions, identifiers between race and everything. They just want a technocratic, top-down, global, utopia where they have authoritarians running everything top down who they believe are credentialed, and then everyone will just fall in line, because that's just magical thinking, right? That's what they want. And they're primarily funded by Europe, less than America, and then corporations, NGOs, things like that. And Soros is just wealth transfer. All he cares about is just destroying the West, because he has sided with the lower guy, I guess. He seems more like an anarchist to me. I still haven't quite figured him quite out, but this is what he wants. He wants a transfer of wealth from the West to the Third World, and then to kind of remove the boot of America from the rest of the world so they can grow and become equally competitive amongst each other, I presume, for him to make money from. I don't know. But yeah, this is the factions. They are a monolith, and within the factions they do wage war against each other. However, the things that unite them are being a part of that faction. So Elon Musk and Klaus Schwab, you would think that they are at odds with each other, but they're in the same faction. They're promoting the same thing. They just have different ways of going about it. That's all this is. The same thing with the neocons, third worldists. All three of them do act together sometimes when they want to push things, because obviously the greatest threat to them is not themselves, it's us. So that confuses people sometimes. The way that this is done is confusing to some people, and I'm going to break this down for you using a flowchart, but this is Parvini's octopus, right? So the way it works is you have a network, which is a billionaire with a nonprofit. They utilize NGOs and they fund, you can't see it, my face is in the way, but it's the media, the head, or it's the mouth. So that's the media, art, culture, Hollywood. The head, which is like think tanks, Harvard, things like that, and then the church. It doesn't have to be a church. Wokistani, like LGBT nonsense. That's a church. It's a religion as well. You can just Marxism. It's a religion, and funding any of those things, it's can fill in for the church. And then above that would be the bench, crown, and chamber. Those are the three forms of governments in the United States. That would be the judiciary, the would be Congress, and then you'd have the president. And then above them is the money people, it's the bankers, the central banks, things like that. And then you have, well, as I said, the network. That's the core pinnacle. The network will fund the church, the head, and the media, and the mouth. And those are then directed through, or like reinforced from like the crown, the chamber, things like that. And they're all funded by Wall Street. This is kind of confusing and makes it's incoherent essentially. So the best way I can do is to use one example, because if I sit here and I go through every single chain of causality, it just looks like a schizoid rant. So I'm going to show you an example, and then you can extrapolate from there. Insert individual here. I call this the laundromat. It's actually quite clever and quite simple, elegant in my opinion. So we're going to start from left to right. Apologies, right to left. All right, and so we're just going to use the Tony Blair Africa Governance Institute. For those of you who do not know, Tony Blair is the UK version of Obama. He's just white. He actually is probably a little more powerful than Obama in the UK. He's kind of like the Dark Lord Emperor kind of guy. We can see here that he has a couple million in his little institute, or his initiative, right? Because he wants to help Africa with his goodwill, right? Well, we can look and we can see that the Fidelity Investment Charitable Gift Fund. You can't really see it super well because it's a bit grainy, but the taxpayer funds is $0, and he has a couple dozen million in there. And we can say, okay, well, where did that money come from? Well, let's take a look. What we have here, the names have been blurred out, more not for like any particular reason. It was just because it was kind of grainy. I couldn't get to fit. But essentially, this right here are political organizations. So you have the World Vision, which has a couple of what looks to be billions, and then you have the Global Communities, right, which has a couple hundred million, and then you have the National Democratic Institute for whatever, I presume the UK or something, and then before there you have the Consortium for Elections, right, and that's on the top. And so those networks, those organizations, what they'll do is they'll get money, and then they'll flow it through another organization, and they'll take that larger amount of money plus the money that organization makes, and they'll push it to another organization, and then another organization, and then it hits the Fidelity Investment Charitable Gift Fund, and then they just give a under the table, here's a couple $100 billion or something like that, to this one specific initiative that then Tony Blair can use as his credit card. This is how the regime would operate across the board. So insert oligarch here. Doesn't matter if it's a politician. It doesn't matter if it's a philanthropist, a CEO. It doesn't matter. If you have money, you can play in their little game, and if you play their game, they will reward you by allowing you access to the levers of power and their system. That's why it's so hard to nail down the quote-unquote deep state or the cabal, whatever, because it's not a fixed group of people like we would imagine kings or something. Like, people like to talk about like the Rockefellers, or with the creation of the Federal Reserve, they talk about the what was that South African guy, the Rhodes Institute, and they created NATO or something, and those are who's behind everything, or oh, it's the Jews. It's just a bunch of individuals who are in the right place at the right time, and they're retarded enough to follow instructions and not ask questions, but cunning enough to screw you all over. And there's millions of them. That is the regime. And they consolidate into factions, and those factions reward each other with access to the financial institutions that we saw prior. And yeah, it's really that simple. The way they can get away with this for so long is by using what we would call the gated institutional narrative, which we will go over here. Now, this is how most people don't understand what anything is and why they're very confused. So I'm going to explain to you how this model works. So let's go with the rent-seeking elite, right? They're losing money because of insert reason here: population decline, IQ decline, or maybe that actually benefits them. And so people aren't spending as much money, right? And so they're like, okay, well, I want to import large numbers of people to suppress wages because I'm having to pay you guys too much. You're not having enough kids. I'm losing money, and I need to see this number grow up or I'm not going to be happy, right? And so what would happen is they will fund the, let's call it the mouth or the head, right, which we saw in that chart breakdown. And they'll have a bunch of colleges release a bunch of studies, like, oh, I have $20 million for you guys to create a study that says this amount of information that I want it to. And they're like, oh, sir, yes, sir, let's get to work. Let's make a bunch of cherry-picked studies that people can fight over and will say is a fact when it's not. And then they'll give it to the media, the mouthpiece, and they'll say, oh, immigration is a universal good. Right, okay, great. Well, it turns out that it actually negatively impacts a lot of people, right? And the people who are negatively impacted, they can call troglodytes. Those are the violent, Naziist, far-right people. That is what we all are villainizing today. Well, it turns out that contrarian independent thinkers also believe those things, but they're not radical. They don't have all of the negative beliefs and connotations as what we would call the troglodytes. They are just contrarians who hold a single idea saying, hey, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Doesn't matter, they get shoved down into that category. And this is how the narrative operates. There is something that makes people money, a small minority, the organized minority, right? They send the ivy-covered dupes to ensure that anyone who thinks otherwise is demonized, and so they can't talk about it in public. And anyone who tries, who is a contrarian or an independent thinker, who is rational and correct, is also shoved in the troglodyte category. So no one is allowed to question it without seeming immoral and thus silenced, because in our civilization, in the US and the West in general, we operate on morality for the most part, and so because we rely a lot less on violence than we have used to prior to World War II. And this is pretty much how they operate. They have things that make them money. They use this narrative to ensure that no one actually looks at it. They will hide all the money they make using the kind of funnel, like the banks and such, that they've used, NGOs, and then they use the octopus in order to ensure that every aspect of our civilization is compromised so that they are left alone and can extract and parasitize more power and money. It's very clever, actually. I'm quite impressed at the thing that they've conceived of here. It must have not been simple or easy at all. And they've been doing this before even the internet. Yeah, whoever invented it, I'm impressed. It's quite well done. But anyway, these people operate off of what I call the code, right? I'm just gonna read it off to you. It's a bit more simple, I think. It's that humans are economic units, right? And because of this, race preference, gender differences, evolutionary strategies, nationalism, and conservatism cannot be allowed as it is unless it's a subvariation of a mimetic ideology that results in removed autonomy from the majority, such as containment, which we will go over in a second, or low-risk, high-yield financial benefit to the regime. Nothing that benefits an outside group outside the regime is allowed, as it creates competition that cannot be absorbed or purchased by them. Now, in this current post-1960s system, they are willing to play ball, they're willing to give concessions. You will either be absorbed into their system or they're going to buy you off. This also includes blackmail. I guess it would be a purchase. You can purchase someone with blackmail. And then any other system, right? So let's say like LGBT, they are allowed to exist because they don't bring anyone up. They just drag down the competition, which would be like the straight white males, right? And so certain groups are allowed to rise because they drag others down, and so they leave the regime alone. And because they see them as economic units to be extracted from them, they don't really care what happens to you. They could all die. They could just take your resources. They don't really care. Number 2 is individualism must be forced as a means of extraction, so long as it pertains to materialistic individualism, of which they can make money from the majority through the consumption of content, i.e. what I'm doing to you here. This is content. And then the purchasing of products. And so Disney is a really good example of this. They create content, and then you can go to the store and buy things that look like that thing that you saw, and you can decorate your house with it or something. That's that individualism that they push, being like, oh, who's your favorite superhero? Oh, it's Spider-Man, right? Oh, okay, well, that is an individual identifier that gives you an identity. So they've hijacked your identity, and they're making money from it by making you go and they're buying things. And it's actually a dual mandate to ensure that the masses are sufficiently sedated and content, but not so enriched to allow any material competition. Again, they don't like competition. Some examples here. So they like concerts. Taylor Swift, as an example, was a big one not too long ago. Call of Duty, video games, right? Funko Pops. They are promoted consumption because they don't create competition, but they create wealth. Things like firearms, force multipliers, they are demonized because they allow for increased agency and threat of competition, even if they can be made money from. I went into this a little bit, but in the prior slide, but they assume what's called an embedded growth obligation, which is no matter what, things just grow and grow and grow and grow. GDP, that's like it has to go up, it will never go down. It's only ever gone up since our data and models show and all this crap. It's bullshit, but they believe that this to be true, that the growth will always continue, and so they act as if things can only increase and get better and improve overall. When this doesn't happen, as has been happening for the better part of 20-ish years, probably before then, I think the Club of Rome was onto it first, they assume the majority is to blame and create schemes to lower the living standard for the majority through engineered consent and ramp up extraction methods to ensure that their wealth continues its trend while the majority becomes increasingly poor and falls into despotism. I give examples down here, but it's like wokeism, anti-homogeneity, which is like the consensual racial genocide of Europeans as a current example, climate change, proxy wars. These are all examples of engineered consent where they use the octopus, right, to churn out insert issue here, and they tell you that it's correct and that it's backed by science or whatever, or it's moral, right? And then they can use that to modify your behavior and then extract further by lowering your living standard, and destroying the culture, to ensure that the embedded growth obligation continues for them where it is exhausted for us. They also, number 4 is they rule as foxes. They rely on 5th generation warfare, which is kayfabe, like pro wrestling essentially, and then scalpel aggression directed at their global race, because the neocons and the all major factions do adhere to a global world system. The neocons like specific identifiers, but they still want everyone to work together and have immigration to be global. They want separate nations that are all mixed. The third worldists wants to throw a bowling ball at the pins and just break it all apart. And then the techno-globalist in the middle wants like a one world system where like you can have different countries, but they are required to have specific like diversity initiatives and things like this. It just makes it easier when you destroy the ethnic identity to extract from them. Everyone who is in a regime is a live target, and if their sedation methods fail, as I went over, they use sedation. They usually will rely on surveillance to monitor anyone who displays non-compliance. The UK does this very efficiently. And then they would remove those who would rise up against them proactively. Baiting into hazard is one of their favorite things. The FBI loves to do this, assuming they were not able to use non-lethal force like intimidation or something. People do slip through the cracks. We have, school shooters, things like that. What they'll do for them is they'll just hang up their body, metaphorically, obviously, and then just vilify and make an example of them. That's really it. That's all they care about for the most part. It's just hyperaccumulation for them, and then abdication of responsibility to whatever civilization they're from, because they are global, and so they can just run to where, like, if something goes to shit, they can just fly somewhere else and live there, and then they can parasitize that and fly somewhere else and go somewhere. They think they can do this forever because their brains are, I would say, not completely aware of natural order. I've met several of these people. They're not in reality at all. A lot of them will talk as if they're like an automated, it's like a euphoria or something. It's very strange to speak to some of these people. So it's not surprising that this is how they conduct themselves. I want to go over 3 ways that they kind of suppress people, and this is pulled from anyone who has read Brave New World. This will be familiar to you. This is not from the book or anything, but this is actively what is used to ensure that anything that they care about is left alone, and then they use these 3 things to stop revolts and revolutions and things of that nature. So this is called containment. The way containment works is a talking point is introduced into the system, right? And there is regime approval, and then there is the incentive, right? So let's just take anti-CRT, for example, right? That's a culture war issue. So if you look to the bottom left, the triple threat to democracy, anything that the regime wants or likes is going to be able to fit in a cultural war, us versus them. What it does not do is address the extractocrats. Now, in the circle there, you have Dem and GOP, which is just left versus right, and then above them it says extractocrats. The Dems and the GOP are the faces, but above them is a separate entity entirely, even though they are a part of that monolith. And then fighting them are the quote-unquote extremists, right? That's why they're the minority. There's 0.0001% or something. They're not significant. But, which is why something like CRT, anti-trans, for example, is allowed, because it only stays in the culture war. It doesn't touch the extractocrats, the regime, for example. Now, if you put something in like anti-vaccine, well, you put that into the culture war, and you start releasing information, there will still be a culture war, but what will happen is it will start impacting the regime. It will impact their money. It will impact their control. And then you get further down to things like World War II revisionism. You throw that into the culture war, and then it actually goes mainstream. You're going to get a lot of information being pushed out that is unfortunately true, and some of it's false, that will absolutely destroy the regime because they need those narratives to maintain moral superiority. Remember, we can go back to the gated institutional narrative slide. That applies there. But yeah, it's literally just this. Anything that's a talking point, if you can plop it into this triple threat to democracy, it doesn't have to be Wokistani versus Magistani. It can just be insert anything here. Anything that is unifying or anything that can lead to information that negatively impacts the regime's capacity for withholding monopoly on power or impacting money will be suppressed. Anything that keeps you busy and arguing on Twitter is allowed and promoted. Sedation is relatively straightforward. I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on this topic because you can just use your head, bread and circuses, right? And then excess of things like food, instant Amazon Prime. You can. I'm going to go over something else in 1 second that's similar to this, but it's different enough where I wanted to go over this. So the sedation would just be like you going on Twitter and seeing these fights, right? It's the K-fabrication, the fake arguments, the nonsense. You go on Amazon Prime, oh, I ordered this new toy or this new game or whatever. Oh, I'm going to go to McDonald's and just stuff my face. That's sedation, right? It's not a need. UFC, as an example, as like modern gladiatory displays and things like that. This is all a means to ensure that you are, I would say, fat enough to not get up and start looking around, put your nose where it needs to go, but not so, I would say, deprived of, let's say, but not so less. Anything that would allow you to obtain extreme amounts of wealth to become a competition will not be allowed. And a lot of this sedation was going to keep you from obtaining that because it keeps you distracted. I think is probably the best way to put that, so I don't monologue and rant and stutter on. The third thing that I think is more important is hyperconsumption. On the right here we have an OnlyFans sleepover, and on the left we have a retro video games haul. Okay, so hyperconsumption occurs when an individual does not feel safe enough and stable enough to feel, and so they retreat into materialism. Now, when I say materialism, I'm talking like physical, like material things. It could be sexual gratification, it could be dopamine hits, it could be anything that can be attained in excess. So the whole gooning shit, right? When you go on Twitter and you see these like twinks arguing about nonsense, about like just jerking off to porn 24/7 or something like that. Video games where it's like for like 3 days straight. That's hyperconsumption. So it is negatively impacting your capacity and ability to be a functional human, and it completely pushes you off. Incels are extremely bad about this. So is the firearms industry, actually. People are like buying so many guns that they don't have room on their walls. It's just, oh, it's just consumerism. Like, oh, look at this shit, look at this shit, look at my buying. That's hyperconsumption. That's not just sedation. This is the preferred tactic of the regime for suppressing young people specifically. This is why we have not had any revolutions yet. This is why Occupy Wall Street only lasted a couple of weeks. All of this is to ensure that the fighting class is sufficiently suppressed and sedated and distracted to the point where they are not capable of even functioning in like a traditional evolved role like us humans are designed to function in, right? And so how does this end, right? When you look at the way the regime power structure is set up, when you look at how everything that we've seen so far is operating, we can look around the world. I don't have to even pull up examples because you have some in your head. This has really one ending, and it's not super positive. And this is what we would call the cultural winter, right? The cultural winter has been a well-discussed phenomena, whether it's Peter Turchin, Oswald Spengler, Thomas Carlyle, Julius Evola, right? All these people have all said the same thing. It's that this system that we've been on, this track, since probably the better part of 1500s, and the regime of the let's say the post-World War II era, has led to an elite that is using a system that has completely destroyed the human capacity to function at all. Everyone's mentally ill and insane, including the regime themselves. Their embedded growth obligation ran out of steam in the 1970s, and we're now resorting to crypto scams and gambling. I mean, the propaganda has gotten so bad to the point where, like, even the most disconnected liberals are asking questions, and they're in their own little echo chamber, and they're so cognitively dissonant that they can't even hold a job. And then the right is retreating, the left is retreating, you have populism on both sides, and the regime's just sitting here like, oh, how can I make money from this? And it's like, no. That's not going to last very long. You're going to end up with revolutions or civil wars, because at some point the food is not going to sustain itself, because the grid is going to start having issues, because everyone is so sedated and retarded and no one knows how to do anything, and the regime is just going to start attacking people. And this is what we would call the death spiral in the winter. This is from Game of Thrones, so is that spiral image in the midst of the winter is a very accurate representation of what's going on now and what will continue to happen. And it's going to get worse, of course. But yeah, I would say, to wrap this all up, the way that power functions is not intuitive, but once it's explained to you, you can kind of just look at the world, go on social media, look at paper trails of money, things like that, and then it makes a lot of sense. And then you can do your part to not participate in it. So, like, for example, I'm uploading this video to Odyssey instead of YouTube, because YouTube is now a slop farm, right? AI nonsense and shit. Odyssey's more of what YouTube used to be, more traditional, human, things like that. And so me switching to that as an example is me pulling away from some of the sedation aspects, or the containment aspects even, and moving to more of, as Evola would call it, riding the tiger, right? Until this death spiral sorts itself out. And it will sort itself out in a absolutely horrid way. We're just kind of waiting for the tiger to run out of steam before that happens, though. I hope this was helpful. I am not a super great talker, especially when I'm talking off the top of my head. None of this, outside of the slide, I don't have any notes here, so this is kind of off the top of my head. If this was helpful, let me know. If you want clarification, let me know. And if you have any issues or any disagreements, please, I'm receptive. I'm not married to 100% of this, but I would say that this is the most correct way of seeing the world and operating that I'm aware of. And I could have gone on to several tangents on every one of these slides, but I wanted to keep this under 40 minutes. So, yeah, that's it. Thanks.